Blackwells Secret. Lady Marjorie of Winthorne had been raised to despise Lord Edmund Warwick, the man responsible for her family's downfall. But when he lifted her veil, his gaze held something unexpected. "You expected hatred," he murmured. "Tell me, my lady, what will you do if you find something else?" Chapter 1. The Unveiling of a Foe. The chill of St. Jude's Cathedral seemed to seep into Marjorie's bones, mirroring the icy dread that had taken root in her heart. The scent of incense, usually a comfort, felt cloying, heavy with the weight of the vows she was about to make. Her fingers, numb beneath the fine, embroidered silk of her gloves, tightened around the small, worn prayer book she held. It was her mother's, a relic of a happier time, a time before the name Warwick became synonymous with ruin. The heavy oak doors of the cathedral creaked open, admitting a gust of wind that stirred the tapestries depicting scenes of saintly sacrifice. A collective gasp rippled through the assembled guests, a mixture of noble families, wary courtiers, and the ever-present, watchful eyes of the king's representatives. Sunlight, fractured by the stained glass windows, painted the stone floor in a mosaic of color, yet Marjorie saw only shadows. She stood at the end of the long aisle, a solitary figure in a gown of deep crimson, the color of Winthorne blood spilled on the battlefield. The fabric, heavy with gold thread and intricate beadwork, felt like a cage, trapping her in a destiny she had fought against with every fiber of her being. Her gaze was fixed on the altar, where the archbishop waited, his face impassive, his vestments shimmering with gold. Beside him stood the man who would soon be her husband, Lord Edmund Warwick. The name itself tasted like ash in her mouth. She had rehearsed her hatred for years, nurtured it like a poisonous bloom in the garden of her grief. He was the architect of her family's downfall, the man who had led the charge that had shattered Winthorne's power, leaving her father a broken man and her brother lost. She had vowed to make him pay, to use this forced marriage as a weapon, to infiltrate his stronghold and bring him down from within. But as he turned, as their eyes met for the first time across the vast expanse of the cathedral, Marjorie found her carefully constructed facade crumbling. He was not the monster she had envisioned. Older, yes, with lines etched around his eyes and a silver thread or two in his dark hair that spoke of battles fought and burdens carried. His face was strong, almost severe, with a high, sculpted brow and a jawline that hinted at stubbornness. But it was his eyes that caught her, held her captive. They were not the cold, cruel eyes of a conqueror. They were the color of a stormy sea, a deep, turbulent blue-gray, and within their depths she saw not triumph, but a weary resignation. A hint of something else, too, a flicker of vulnerability that she had not expected, that she did not want to see. The archbishop's voice, resonant and solemn, filled the cathedral, reciting the ancient words of the marriage rite. Marjorie felt a tremor run through her, a wave of panic threatening to engulf her. She wanted to scream, to run, to tear the crimson gown from her body and flee back to the shattered remnants of her former life. But she was Lady Marjorie of Winthorne, and Winthorne did not yield. Edmund stepped forward, his movements measured and deliberate. He wore the colors of his house, deep blue and silver, and the war crest, a snarling wolf, was emblazoned on his surcoat. He looked every inch the powerful lord, the formidable warrior, yet there was a stillness about him, a sense of profound solitude that resonated with something deep within Marjorie's own wounded soul. He reached for her hand, his touch surprisingly gentle. His fingers, calloused from years of wielding a sword, brushed against hers, sending a jolt of unexpected warmth through her icy veins. He lifted the heavy veil that obscured her face, the silk whispering against her skin like a secret promise. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other. The cathedral faded away, the murmurs of the crowd receding into silence. There was only the two of them, caught in a web of history, hatred, and the undeniable pull of something far more complex. He saw the defiance in her emerald green eyes, the proud tilt of her chin, the barely concealed tremor in her hands. He saw the ghost of the girl she had been, before the war had stolen her innocence and replaced it with a steely resolve. He also saw a deep well of sadness. "You expected hatred," he murmured, his voice low, barely audible above the echoing silence of the cathedral. It was not a question, but a statement of fact. A challenge. Marjorie met his gaze, refusing to flinch, refusing to show any weakness. She had prepared herself for this moment, had steeled herself against his arrogance, his disdain. But his words, his unexpected perception, disarmed her. "Tell me, my lady," he continued, his voice a silken thread woven through the tapestry of her fear, "what will you do if you find something else?" His question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken possibilities. It was a question that echoed the turmoil within her own heart, the unsettling realization that the man she had vowed to destroy was not the one-dimensional villain she had imagined. That beneath the armor, beneath the reputation, there was a human being capable of both cruelty and something akin to sorrow. The archbishop cleared his throat, a subtle reminder that the ceremony must proceed. But the moment, the unspoken exchange, had shifted something fundamental between them. The battle lines had been drawn, yes, but the terrain had changed. Marjorie found herself standing on the precipice of a new, unknown battlefield, one where the weapons were not swords and shields, but words and glances, secrets and desires. The vows were exchanged, binding them together with legal and holy solemnity, but Marjorie felt the weight of the unspoken, the unresolved, pressing down on her with more force than the heavy gold ring placed on her finger. She was no longer simply Lady Marjorie of Winthorne. She was Lady Warwick, bound to a man she had sworn to hate, a man who now held her future, and perhaps her heart, in his hands. She stepped back, away from the slight warmth of his presence, and, with an icy determination, prepared for the long, cold war ahead. She was no longer sure what that war would be. Chapter 2. Shadows of Winthorne's Past. The journey to Warwick Keep was a blur of bleak landscapes and strained silence. Marjorie sat stiffly in the carriage, the plush velvet cushions offering little comfort. The rhythmic clatter of the horses' hooves and the creak of the wheels were a constant reminder of her displacement, of the irreversible journey she had undertaken. Each mile took her further from Winthorne, from the familiar scent of the rose gardens, the comforting sound of the river that flowed through her ancestral lands, the memories both joyful and painful that were woven into the very fabric of her being. She stole glances at her husband, who rode alongside the carriage on a magnificent black stallion. He sat tall in the saddle, his posture impeccable, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He seemed impervious to the cold, to the bleakness of the landscape, to the palpable tension that emanated from her. He was a study in controlled power, a man who had mastered the art of concealing his emotions. Or perhaps, she thought bitterly, he had none to conceal. The memories of Winthorne, once a source of strength, now felt like a fresh wound. She remembered her father, Lord Alaric, a man of laughter and unwavering loyalty, reduced to a shadow of his former self after the battle. She remembered the vibrant tapestries that had adorned the walls of Winthorne Hall, depicting scenes of their family's glorious past, now ripped and torn, symbols of their shattered legacy. And then there was Liam, her brother. The image of his laughing face, his playful teasing, his unwavering belief in her strength, was a constant ache in her heart. He had ridden out to meet Warwick's forces with a youthful confidence, a belief in the righteousness of their cause. He had never returned. The official report spoke of a valiant death, of a hero's sacrifice. But Marjorie knew, in the deepest recesses of her soul, that the truth was far more brutal. She had seen the glint of cruel satisfaction in Warwick's eyes when the news of Liam's death had been delivered. It was a look she would never forget, a look that fueled her hatred and her thirst for revenge. But now, that hatred felt complicated. The brief exchange in the cathedral, his unexpected question, had planted a seed of doubt in her mind. She found herself searching his face for signs of the monster she had expected, for the arrogance and cruelty that had been attributed to him. But she found only a weariness, a profound solitude that mirrored her own. As dusk began to settle, painting the sky in shades of purple and gray, they reached the outskirts of Warwick lands. The landscape here was starkly different from the rolling hills and lush meadows of Winthorn. Jagged cliffs rose from the mist-shrouded valleys, and the wind howled through the ancient forests, carrying with it the scent of pine and damp earth. It was a wild, untamed land, a reflection of the man who ruled it. Warwick Keep itself was a formidable sight. It stood perched atop a craggy peak, its gray stone walls blending seamlessly with the surrounding landscape. It was a fortress, built for defense, not for comfort. Its towers pierced the sky like skeletal fingers, and its battlements were scarred with the marks of countless sieges. It was a place of power, of resilience, and of secrets. As they approached the main gate, the drawbridge was lowered with a resounding groan. The courtyard, illuminated by flickering torches, was a hive of activity. Soldiers in Warwick livery stood guard, their faces grim and watchful. Servants scurried about, preparing for the arrival of their new mistress. The air was thick with the smell of wood smoke and roasting meat, mingled with the ever-present scent of horses and steel. Edmund dismounted and strode towards the carriage, his movements fluid and graceful despite the heavy armor he wore. He offered his hand to Marjorie, his touch surprisingly gentle. She hesitated for a moment, her pride warring with the necessity of accepting his assistance. Finally, she placed her hand in his, feeling the warmth of his calloused palm against her glove. He helped her down from the carriage, his eyes meeting hers for a fleeting moment. There was no warmth in his gaze, but neither was there the cold disdain she had expected. It was as if he were assessing her, measuring her strength, her resolve. "Welcome to Warwick Keep, my lady," he said, his voice devoid of any inflection. It was a statement of fact, not a greeting. Marjorie lifted her chin, meeting his gaze with a steely determination. "It is my keep now, as well," she replied, her voice clear and steady, despite the tremor in her heart. A flicker of something surprise, perhaps, or even amusement crossed his face. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the mask of impassivity he seemed to wear so effortlessly. He led her through the massive wooden doors and into the great hall. The hall was vast and imposing, with a high, vaulted ceiling and walls adorned with tapestries depicting scenes of Warwick victories. A long, wooden table dominated the center of the room, set for a feast. The air was thick with the smell of roasted meat and spices, mingled with the scent of beeswax and damp stone. The assembled household staff bowed low as they entered, their eyes filled with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Marjorie felt their scrutiny, their unspoken questions. She was the outsider, the enemy, brought into their midst by force. She knew she would have to earn their respect, their loyalty, if she were to survive in this hostile environment. Edmund gestured towards a high-backed chair at the head of the table. "Your place, my lady," he said, his voice still devoid of any warmth. Marjorie walked towards the chair, her steps measured and deliberate. She felt a pang of longing for the familiar comforts of Winthorn, for the warmth of her family, for the life that had been stolen from her. But she knew she could not afford to show any weakness. She was Lady Warwick now, and she would face her new life, her new enemy, with courage and determination. As she was seated, a servant approached, offering a goblet. The contents smelled strongly of wine and spices. She accepted, raising it to her lips, but she barely tasted it. Her mind, and the memory of her brother, kept circling back to Edmund. He had been the one. But, as she looked back across the hall and locked eyes with him once more, doubt began to creep in. Could he truly be the one? Chapter 3. Oaths sworn in haste. The feast was a blur of unfamiliar faces, forced smiles, and strained conversation. Marjorie sat at the head of the table, beside Edmund, feeling like a prisoner in a gilded cage. The food, though plentiful and richly spiced, tasted like ashes in her mouth. The wine, though potent, did little to quell the turmoil within her. She observed the Warwick household with a keen, watchful eye. There was Lady Agnes, Edmund's aunt, a woman of sharp features and even sharper tongue, who seemed to regard Marjorie with a mixture of suspicion and disdain. There was Sir Reginald, Edmund's cousin and closest adviser, a man of imposing stature and a reputation for ruthlessness. And there were countless other knights, squires, and ladies-in-waiting, all of whom seemed to be measuring her, judging her worthiness to be their new mistress. Edmund, for his part, remained largely silent throughout the meal. He ate sparingly, drank moderately, and spoke only when necessary. He seemed to be observing her as closely as she was observing him, his eyes constantly flickering towards her, assessing her reactions, her demeanor. Marjorie tried to engage in polite conversation with Lady Agnes, attempting to bridge the chasm of animosity that separated them. But the older woman's responses were curt and dismissive, her words laced with a subtle venom that made Marjorie's blood boil. Winthorne was known for its delicate sensibilities, Lady Agnes said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. I trust you will find Warwick Keep to be somewhat less refined. Marjorie met her gaze, refusing to be intimidated. I am adaptable, my lady, she replied, her voice calm and steady. I have learned to survive in less than ideal circumstances. Lady Agnes raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. Indeed, one must be resourceful to survive a fall from grace. The insult was thinly veiled, a direct reference to Winthorne's defeat. Marjorie felt her anger rising, but she forced herself to remain composed. She would not give this woman the satisfaction of seeing her lose control. Grace is not measured by victory alone, my lady, Marjorie countered, her voice laced with a subtle steel. It is also measured by courage, by loyalty, by the ability to endure. Lady Agnes's lips curled into a thin smile. Admirable sentiments, my lady. But sentiments are easily broken in the face of reality. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a messenger, bearing a sealed scroll with the royal crest. Edmund took the scroll, breaking the seal with a swift, practiced movement. He scanned the contents, his face growing grim. The king summons us to court, he announced, his voice devoid of any emotion. There are matters of state that require our attention. A murmur of unease rippled through the hall. The king's summons was rarely a cause for celebration. It usually meant trouble, intrigue, or worse, war. Marjorie felt a knot of apprehension tighten in her stomach. She had hoped for a period of respite, a chance to adjust to her new life, to gather her strength and formulate her plans. But it seemed that fate, or perhaps the king, had other ideas. Edmund turned to her, his eyes meeting hers across the table. We leave at dawn, my lady, he said. Be ready. His words were a command, not a request. But there was something else in his voice, a hint of concern? Or perhaps it was simply the weight of responsibility, the burden of leadership. Marjorie nodded, her mind racing. This unexpected summons had thrown her plans into disarray. She had intended to use her time at Warwick Keep to uncover secrets, to find evidence of Edmund's treachery, to bring him down from within. But now, she would be thrust into the heart of the royal court, surrounded by enemies, with no allies to rely on. As the feast drew to a close, Edmund rose from his chair, signaling the end of the evening. The guests dispersed, leaving Marjorie alone with her thoughts. She felt a profound sense of isolation, of vulnerability. She was a stranger in a strange land, surrounded by those who distrusted her, with a husband who was an enigma, a man she had sworn to hate, but who continued to challenge her preconceived notions. She retired to her chambers, a lavishly appointed room that felt cold and impersonal despite its luxurious furnishings. She dismissed her handmaiden, a young woman named Alara, who seemed more wary than welcoming. She needed time alone, time to think, to strategize. She stood by the window, gazing out at the moonlit landscape. The wind howled through the battlements, carrying with it the whispers of the past, the echoes of oaths sworn in haste, of promises broken, of lives shattered. She thought of her father, of Liam, of the lost glory of Winthorne. She thought of Edmund, of the unexpected complexity she had glimpsed beneath his stoic facade. She knew she was walking a dangerous path, that one wrong step could lead to her destruction. But she was Lady Marjorie of Winthorne, and she would not falter. She would face the challenges ahead with courage, with determination, with the unwavering belief that she would somehow, someday find justice for her family, and perhaps even find peace for herself. She closed her eyes and muttered a prayer to whatever gods that may be listening. She could only trust herself. Chapter 4. The Cold Hearth of Warwick Keep. The days following the king's summons were a study in contrasts. The frantic preparations for the journey to court were juxtaposed with the unsettling stillness of Warwick Keep itself. Marjorie found herself caught between the whirlwind of activity and the oppressive silence of her own thoughts. She spent her days exploring the castle, familiarizing herself with its labyrinthine corridors, its hidden chambers, its imposing defenses. She learned the names and faces of the household staff, attempting to establish a rapport with them, to earn their trust, or at least their tolerance. But she was met with a wall of reserve, a polite distance that made her feel like an outsider, an intruder in her own home. Alara, her handmaiden, was a constant presence, but their interactions were formal and strained. The young woman seemed to be afraid of her, or perhaps simply wary of her Winthorn heritage. Marjorie tried to engage her in conversation, to learn more about her life, her hopes, her fears. But Alara's responses were guarded, her eyes constantly darting towards the door, as if expecting to be summoned away at any moment. The evenings were the most difficult. After the evening meal, which she shared with Edmund and Lady Agnes, Marjorie would retreat to her chambers, feeling a profound sense of loneliness. The room, though lavishly furnished, felt cold and empty. The fire in the hearth, though constantly tended, did little to dispel the chill that seemed to seep from the very stones of the castle. She tried to occupy herself with reading, with embroidery, with prayer. But her mind kept returning to the same questions, the same uncertainties. What was Edmund's true nature? What were his motives? What did he expect of her? And what, if anything, did he feel for her? She had caught him watching her on several occasions, his eyes filled with a strange intensity that she could not decipher. It was not the look of a conqueror gloating over his prize. It was something more complex, more unsettling. It was as if he were trying to see through her, to understand the woman beneath the mask of defiance she presented to the world. One evening, as she sat by the window, gazing out at the moonlit landscape, she heard a knock on the door. It was Edmund. He stood in the doorway, his tall figure silhouetted against the flickering torchlight in the corridor. He wore a simple tunic and breeches, his usual armor absent. He looked less formidable, more human. "May I come in?" he asked, his voice low and surprisingly gentle. Marjorie hesitated for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest. She was both apprehensive and intrigued. She nodded, gesturing for him to enter. He stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. He stood for a moment, looking at her, his eyes searching her face. "I wanted to apologize," he said, his voice unexpectedly hesitant. Marjorie raised an eyebrow, surprised. "Apologize? For what?" "For the circumstances of our marriage," he said. "For the pain I have caused your family." The words were unexpected, almost shocking. She had expected arrogance, disdain, perhaps even a veiled threat. But not an apology. "Your apology is meaningless," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "It cannot bring back my brother. It cannot restore Winthorn's honor." He nodded, his gaze unwavering. "I know," he said. "But I wanted you to know that I am not without remorse." He paused, as if searching for the right words. "I did what I believed was necessary," he continued. "I followed my king's orders. I fought for what I believed was right." "And what was that?" Marjorie asked, her voice laced with bitterness. "The destruction of an innocent family? The slaughter of unarmed men?" He flinched, as if her words had struck a physical blow. "War is never innocent," he said quietly. "There are always casualties. There are always regrets." He looked away, his gaze fixed on the fire in the hearth. "I lost someone too," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Someone I cared for deeply." Marjorie felt a jolt of surprise. She had not expected him to speak of personal loss, of vulnerability. It was a glimpse behind the mask, a hint of the man beneath the warrior. "Who?" she asked, her voice softer now, her curiosity piqued. He hesitated for a moment, then turned back to her, his eyes filled with a deep sadness. "Her name was Alara," he said. "She was a lady in waiting to my mother. The same name as her handmaiden." The coincidence was chilling. Marjorie felt a strange mix of emotions: surprise, curiosity, and a flicker of empathy. She realized, with a sudden clarity, that he was not the one-dimensional villain she had imagined. He was a man who had suffered loss, who carried his own burdens, his own regrets. The realization did not erase her anger, her grief, but it complicated it. It made it harder to hate him, harder to see him as simply an enemy. It opened the possibility, how slight it might be, for something else. He continued to speak, the words pouring out, as a confession made, alone by the fire. "She died in a raid, a Windthorn raid. Years ago." Marjorie held her breath as he spoke of his loss. She wanted to feel validated, to feel justified in her hatred. But she could not. He turned from the fire and stepped close. "I know I cannot undo the past, and I would never ask you to forget." But that perhaps his voice trailed. He stepped back as quickly as he had approached, and with no further words, he exited the room. Chapter 5. Whispers in the Stone Halls. The journey to the king's court was a stark contrast to the somber atmosphere of Warwick Keep. The royal procession was a spectacle of color and pageantry, a display of power and wealth designed to impress and intimidate. Marjorie rode in a gilded carriage, adorned with the Warwick crest, surrounded by a contingent of knights and ladies in waiting. She wore a gown of deep blue velvet, embroidered with silver thread, a subtle nod to her new allegiance. But beneath the outward display of unity, Marjorie felt a profound sense of isolation. She was an outsider, a pawn in a game of political intrigue, surrounded by those who viewed her with suspicion, or worse, outright hostility. Lady Agnes, who accompanied them, made no secret of her disdain, her every word and gesture a reminder of Marjorie's precarious position. Edmund, for his part, remained distant and unreadable. He rode at the head of the procession, his posture impeccable, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He seemed to be deliberately avoiding her, speaking to her only when necessary, and even then, his words were formal and impersonal. Marjorie found herself observing him with a growing sense of curiosity. She had glimpsed a vulnerability in him, a hint of the man beneath the warrior, during their conversation in her chambers. But now, he seemed to have retreated behind his mask of impassivity, concealing his emotions, his thoughts, his true nature. The king's court was a hive of activity, a swirling vortex of ambition, betrayal, and whispered secrets. Marjorie felt like a lamb among wolves, navigating a treacherous landscape where one wrong step could lead to her downfall. She was constantly aware of being watched, judged, assessed. She was presented to the king, a man of imposing stature and a reputation for ruthlessness. He greeted her with a formal courtesy, his eyes sharp and assessing. He made no mention of the circumstances of her marriage, but Marjorie sensed his unspoken disapproval, his awareness of the animosity between the Windthorn and Warwick families. The queen, a woman of renowned beauty and political acumen, was more subtle in her approach. She greeted Marjorie with a warm smile, her words seemingly genuine. But Marjorie sensed a hidden agenda, a careful calculation behind the queen's apparent kindness. "Welcome to court, Lady Warwick," the queen said, her voice smooth and melodious. "I trust you will find it stimulating." Marjorie met her gaze, her own expression carefully neutral. "I am honored to be here, Your Majesty," she replied. "I am eager to serve the realm." The queen's smile widened, but her eyes remained watchful. "Indeed, service is the cornerstone of our noble duty, but loyalty is the true measure of one's worth." The words were a veiled warning, a reminder of Marjorie's precarious position. She was a Windthorn, married to a Warwick, caught in the crosscurrents of ancient rivalries and political machinations. Her loyalty would be constantly tested, her every action scrutinized. The days at court were a blur of formal events, elaborate banquets, and whispered conversations. Marjorie found herself drawn into a world of intrigue, where alliances shifted like sand and secrets were traded like currency. She learned to navigate the treacherous currents of courtly life, to decipher the hidden meanings behind veiled words, to discern friend from foe. She also encountered other members of the court who were sympathetic to her plight. Lord Elmsworth, an elderly nobleman with a reputation for wisdom and integrity, offered her a quiet word of encouragement. "Be careful, my lady," he said, his voice low and conspiratorial. "The court is a dangerous place. Trust no one completely." His words were a chilling reminder of the dangers she faced. She was surrounded by enemies, both open and hidden. She had no allies to rely on, except perhaps Edmund. She found herself seeking him out, observing him from across crowded halls, trying to decipher the enigma that he presented. She noticed the way he interacted with others, the respect he commanded, the subtle fear he inspired. She also noticed the weariness in his eyes, the lines of strain around his mouth, the burden of leadership he carried. One evening, during a particularly lavish banquet, she found herself seated near him. He seemed different. He was more relaxed, more approachable. He engaged in conversation with those around him, his voice laced with a dry wit that surprised her. He turned to her, his eyes meeting hers across the table. There was a hint of warmth in his gaze, a flicker of something that resembled connection. "Are you enjoying the festivities, my lady?" he asked, his voice low and intimate. Marjorie hesitated, unsure how to respond. She was still wary of him, still unsure of his motives. But she also felt a pull towards him, a curiosity that she could not deny. "It is different from Warwick Keep," she replied, her voice carefully neutral. He smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. "Indeed. The court is a different beast altogether." He paused, then added, his voice softer now, "I hope you are not too uncomfortable here." The words were unexpected, almost tender. They were a glimpse of the man she had seen in her chambers, the man who had apologized for his actions, who had spoken of his own loss. The moment was broken when another noble joined and spoke in hushed tones to Edmund. As he spoke, Edmund's expression changed to one of serious concern. When the man left, Marjorie could bear her curiosity no longer. She was here, trapped in this life. She needed answers. She needed to know. Chapter 6. The Falcon and the Dove. What was that about? Marjorie asked, her voice barely a whisper, trying to keep the tremor of anxiety from betraying her. Edmund hesitated, his gaze flickering around the crowded hall, ensuring their conversation remained private. "A matter of some delicacy," he replied, his voice equally low, his expression guarded. "Concerning the northern borders." Marjorie knew that the northern borders were a constant source of tension, a volatile region where skirmishes and raids were commonplace. But there was something in his tone, a subtle unease, that suggested this was more than a routine border dispute. "Is it serious?" she pressed, her curiosity overcoming her caution. He met her gaze, his eyes searching her face, as if assessing her trustworthiness. "Potentially," he admitted. "There are rumors of a growing rebellion, of alliances being forged against the king." Marjorie felt a chill run down her spine. Rebellion was a dangerous word, a word that could lead to bloodshed, to chaos, to the overthrow of the established order. And if the rumors were true, if alliances were being forged against the king, it meant that she and Edmund, as representatives of the crown, were in a precarious position. "Who is behind it?" she asked, her voice barely audible above the din of the banquet. Edmund hesitated again, his gaze flickering towards a group of nobles gathered near the entrance to the hall. Among them was Lord Astley, a man known for his ambition and his ruthlessness. He was also a known rival of the Warwicks, a man who had long coveted their lands and their influence. "There are suspicions," Edmund said, his voice carefully neutral. "But no proof yet." Marjorie understood. In the treacherous world of court politics, accusations without proof could be deadly. One had to tread carefully, to gather evidence, to build alliances, before making a move. "And what will you do?" she asked, her voice filled with a mixture of apprehension and a strange sense of anticipation. He turned to her, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her heart skip a beat. "I will investigate," he said. "I will uncover the truth, and I will protect the realm." His words were a statement of purpose, a declaration of his loyalty to the king. But there was something else in his voice, a hint of determination, a resolve that sent a shiver of excitement through her. In that moment, Marjorie saw him not just as her husband, not just as the man who had brought ruin to her family, but as a leader, a warrior, a man who was willing to risk everything to protect his people, his lands, his king. And she realized, with a sudden clarity, that she was drawn to him, not in the way of a love-struck maiden, but with a respect and admiration for his strength, his courage, his unwavering sense of duty. She felt the urge, the compulsion, almost to help him, to protect him. The image of a falcon came to her mind, a powerful bird of prey, soaring high above the earth, its eyes sharp and watchful. Edmund was like that falcon, a creature of strength and grace, a predator who could be both ruthless and protective. And she was the dove, a symbol of peace, of innocence, caught in the falcon's shadow. But perhaps, she thought, the dove could also be strong, could also be resourceful, could also play a role in this dangerous game. The banquet continued, but Marjorie's mind was elsewhere. She was thinking about the rumors of rebellion, about Lord Astley's ambition, about Edmund's determination to uncover the truth. She knew she was walking a dangerous path, that she was caught in a web of intrigue that could easily ensnare her. But she also felt a sense of purpose, a determination to play her part, to use her position, her knowledge, her instincts, to help Edmund, to protect him, to perhaps even find a way to bridge the chasm that separated them. As the evening drew to a close, Edmund approached her, his expression serious. "I must ride north tomorrow," he said, his voice low and urgent, "to investigate these rumors." Marjorie felt a pang of fear, a sudden realization of the danger he was facing. "Be careful," she said, her voice trembling slightly. He met her gaze, his eyes filled with a warmth that she had not seen before. "I will," he said. "And thank you." "For what?" she asked, puzzled. "For your concern," he replied, his voice surprisingly gentle. "It means more than you know." He turned to leave, but then paused, as if struck by a sudden thought. "Stay close to the Queen. She is a shrewd and powerful woman, and she can protect you." She nodded. The Queen. It was not the answer she had wanted, but it was the smart move. He bowed and left. Chapter 7. A glimpse of the man within. The days following Edmund's departure were filled with a strange mixture of anxiety and anticipation. Marjorie found herself constantly thinking about him, worrying about his safety, wondering what he was doing, what he was discovering. She missed his presence, his quiet strength, his unsettling gaze. She followed his advice and stayed close to the Queen, observing her, learning from her, trying to decipher her true intentions. The Queen, for her part, seemed to take Marjorie under her wing, guiding her through the treacherous currents of courtly life, offering advice, sharing confidences. "The court is a stage, my lady," the Queen said one afternoon, as they strolled through the royal gardens. "And we are all actors, playing our assigned roles. But the key to survival is to know when to improvise." Marjorie nodded, understanding the wisdom of her words. She had already learned that appearances could be deceiving, that words could be weapons, that alliances could shift like sand. She had to be adaptable, resourceful, and ruthless if necessary. The Queen also shared stories about Edmund, revealing aspects of his character that Marjorie had not known. She spoke of his childhood, of his early training as a knight, of his unwavering loyalty to his family, his people, his king. "He is a man of deep convictions," the Queen said, her voice filled with a mixture of admiration and perhaps a hint of regret. "He believes in duty, in honor, in sacrifice. But he also carries a heavy burden, the weight of his responsibilities, the scars of his past." Marjorie listened intently, her curiosity piqued. She wanted to know more about Edmund, about the man beneath the warrior, about the scars that he carried. She wanted to understand what drove him, what motivated him, what made him so compelling. One evening, as she sat alone in her chambers, she received a message from Lord Elmsworth, the elderly nobleman who had offered her a word of caution earlier. He requested a private meeting, claiming to have information of vital importance. Marjorie hesitated, wary of a trap. But she also knew that Lord Elmsworth was a man of integrity, a man who had no reason to deceive her. She decided to take the risk. She met him in a secluded alcove in the library, a place where they could speak without being overheard. He looked pale and shaken, his hands trembling slightly. "I have disturbing news, my lady," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Concerning Lord Warwick." Marjorie's heart skipped a beat. "What is it?" she asked, her voice filled with apprehension. "I have reason to believe that he is in danger," Lord Elmsworth said. "That there are those who plot against him, who seek to undermine his authority to perhaps even eliminate him." Marjorie felt a chill run down her spine. She had suspected as much, but to hear it confirmed, to know that Edmund's life was in danger, filled her with a sense of dread. "Who?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Who is plotting against him?" Lord Elmsworth hesitated, his gaze darting around the room, ensuring they were alone. "Lord Astley is involved," he said. "And others. Powerful men close to the king." Marjorie's mind raced. Lord Astley was a known rival of the Warwicks, a man who had long coveted their lands and their influence. But to plot against Edmund, to seek to eliminate him, was a treasonous act, a crime punishable by death. "We must warn him," she said, her voice filled with urgency. "We must find a way to protect him." Lord Elmsworth nodded, his expression grim. "I have a plan," he said. "But it is dangerous. It requires courage and discretion." He outlined his plan, a daring scheme to send a message to Edmund, warning him of the plot against him. It involved a network of trusted contacts, a secret code, and a perilous journey through enemy territory. Marjorie listened intently, her mind racing. The plan was risky, fraught with danger, but she knew she had to do it. She could not stand idly by while Edmund's life was in danger. She had to act, to protect him, to repay the debt she felt she owed him. Or perhaps she just had to be near. "I will do it," she said, her voice firm, her resolve unwavering. "I will do whatever it takes to save him." Lord Elmsworth looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of admiration and concern. "Be careful, my lady," he said. "The stakes are higher than you know." As she left the library, she bumped into a cloaked figure who seemed to be eavesdropping. She could not see the face, but she felt as though she knew who it might be. She steeled herself and carried on. She had to warn Edmund. Chapter 8. The Price of Loyalty. The following days were a blur of clandestine meetings, secret messages, and perilous preparations. Marjorie worked closely with Lord Elmsworth, putting his plan into action, navigating the treacherous currents of court politics with a newfound determination. She used her position as Lady Warwick, her proximity to the Queen, to gather information, to build alliances, to lay the groundwork for their daring scheme. She discovered that the plot against Edmund was far more extensive than she had initially imagined. It involved not only Lord Astley, but also several other powerful nobles, all of whom had grievances against the Warwicks or coveted their influence. They were secretly funding the rebellion in the north, hoping to use it as a pretext to overthrow Edmund and seize control of his lands. Marjorie also learned that the king himself was unaware of the plot. He was being manipulated by his advisors, fed false information, kept in the dark about the true extent of the conspiracy. She realized that she had to find a way to reach the king, to expose the traitors, to save both Edmund and the realm from chaos. She sought the Queen's help, confiding in her, sharing her suspicions, pleading for her assistance. The Queen listened intently, her expression grave. She had long suspected that something was amiss, that there were those within the court who were working against the king's interests. But she had lacked proof, evidence that she could present to the king without risking her own position. "This is a dangerous game, my lady," the Queen said, her voice filled with concern. "You are putting yourself at great risk." Marjorie nodded, her resolve unwavering. "I know," she said. But I cannot stand idly by while Edmund's life is in danger, while the realm is threatened." The queen looked at her, her eyes filled with a mixture of admiration and something else. Something that resembled affection. "You are a remarkable woman, Lady Warwick," she said. "You have the courage of a lioness and the heart of a dove." She paused, then added, her voice softer now, "I will help you. I will do whatever I can to expose these traitors, to protect Edmund, and to save the realm." With the Queen's support, Marjorie's plan gained momentum. They worked together, gathering evidence, building alliances, preparing to confront the king with the truth. They knew that the stakes were high, that one wrong step could lead to their downfall. But they were determined to succeed, to save Edmund, to protect the realm, to fulfill their duty. Meanwhile, Marjorie continued to worry about Edmund. She had received no word from him since his departure, and the silence was deafening. She feared for his safety, imagining him facing danger alone, unaware of the plot against him. One evening, as she sat alone in her chambers, she received a message delivered by a trusted servant. It was from Edmund. The message was brief, written in a hurried hand. It said simply, "I have uncovered the truth. The rebellion is far greater than we imagined. I am returning to court with proof. Be careful." They know. Marjorie's heart pounded in her chest. Edmund was alive. He had uncovered the truth, and he was returning to court. But he was also in danger. They knew. The traitors knew that he was aware of their plot, and they would stop at nothing to silence him. She knew she had to act quickly, to prepare for his arrival, to ensure his safety, to expose the traitors before they could strike. She met with the Queen, sharing Edmund's message, outlining their plan. They agreed to confront the king the following day, during the royal audience, presenting him with the evidence they had gathered. As Marjorie left the Queen's chambers, feeling that all was nearly lost, she had the sense of being watched. She spun on her heel, and there, down the dimly lit corridor, was the cloaked figure. Again, she knew, without a doubt, who it must be. Lady Agnes. Chapter 9. Beneath a Blanket of Stars. The night before Edmund's anticipated return was heavy with a sense of impending doom. Marjorie found sleep elusive, her mind racing with 1,000 anxieties. She tossed and turned in her lavish bed, the silk sheets feeling like a suffocating shroud. The weight of responsibility, the fear for Edmund's safety, the knowledge of the treacherous plot that surrounded them, all pressed down on her with an almost unbearable force. She rose before dawn, unable to bear the confines of her chambers any longer. She dressed in a simple gown, eschewing the elaborate jewels and adornments that were customary for court. She felt a need for simplicity, for authenticity, for a connection to something real and grounding amidst the artifice and deception of her surroundings. She made her way to the castle gardens, seeking solace in the quiet beauty of nature. The air was cool and crisp, carrying the scent of dew-kissed roses and damp earth. The first rays of sunlight were beginning to paint the eastern sky in shades of pale pink and gold, chasing away the lingering shadows of the night. She found a secluded bench beneath an ancient oak tree, its branches reaching up towards the heavens like supplicating arms. She sat there, watching the dawn break, feeling a strange sense of peace settle over her. It was as if the beauty of the natural world, the timeless rhythm of the seasons, offered a momentary respite from the turmoil of her inner world. As she sat there, lost in thought, she heard a familiar sound, the soft whir of a falcon's wings. She looked up and saw a magnificent bird of prey circling overhead, its keen eyes scanning the landscape below. It was Edmund's falcon, the one he had trained himself, the one that was his constant companion. The sight of the falcon filled her with a sudden surge of hope. It was a sign, a message, a reassurance that Edmund was near, that he was alive, that he was returning to her. She watched as the falcon landed on a nearby branch, its gaze fixed on her. She felt a strange connection to the bird, a sense of kinship, a shared understanding. It was as if the falcon, a creature of the wild, a symbol of freedom and power, embodied the spirit of Edmund himself. She rose from the bench and walked towards the falcon, her hand outstretched. The bird did not flinch, did not fly away. It simply watched her, its eyes filled with an intelligence that seemed almost human. "He is coming, isn't he?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the rustling of the leaves. The falcon tilted its head, as if in response, and then let out a sharp cry, a sound that echoed through the stillness of the morning. It was a cry of recognition, of greeting, of warning. Marjorie felt a sudden chill run down her spine. She knew, instinctively, that the falcon was trying to tell her something, that Edmund was in danger, that she had to act quickly. She turned and ran back towards the castle, her heart pounding in her chest. She had to find the queen, to warn her, to prepare for Edmund's arrival. She had to expose the traitors, to protect him, to save him. As she ran, she heard the sound of horses' hooves, the clatter of armor, the shouts of men. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that Edmund had arrived. But he had not arrived alone. He had been followed, ambushed. She burst into the main courtyard, just as a scene of chaos unfolded before her. Edmund, his face grim and determined, was fighting off a group of armed men, his sword flashing in the early morning light. He was outnumbered, surrounded, but he fought with the ferocity of a cornered lion. Marjorie saw Lord Astley, his face contorted with rage, directing the attack. He was shouting orders, urging his men to kill Edmund, to silence him before he could reveal their treachery. Marjorie screamed, a primal cry of anguish and fury. She ran towards the fray, heedless of the danger, determined to help Edmund, to protect him, to fight alongside him. She grabbed a discarded sword from the ground, its weight surprisingly familiar in her hand. She had trained with her brother, Liam, in the gardens of Winthorn, learning the basics of swordsmanship, practicing for hours until her arms ached. She had never thought she would use those skills in a real battle, but now, she had no choice. She charged into the melee, her sword raised, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and adrenaline. She fought with a ferocity she had not known she possessed, driven by a primal instinct to protect the man she had sworn to hate, the man who had become something more. Something she could not, would not lose. She felt, more than saw, the blows coming, and with the skill that she did not know she still possessed, she deflected. She felt her arm ache, but pushed that thought aside. She would not fall. She would not fail. Chapter 10. The Serpent in the Garden. The courtyard became a whirlwind of steel and blood. Marjorie fought with a desperate courage, driven by a fierce protectiveness towards Edmund. She parried blows, dodged attacks, and even managed to land a few strikes of her own, surprising her attackers with her unexpected skill. She saw Edmund fighting nearby, his movements fluid and graceful despite the desperate odds. He was a force of nature, a warrior in his element, but even he could not hold off so many attackers indefinitely. She saw him take a blow to the arm, his face contorting in pain, but he continued to fight, his determination unwavering. Marjorie fought her way towards him, cutting down one attacker, pushing another aside, her eyes fixed on Edmund, her heart pounding with a desperate hope. She had to reach him, to help him, to save him. As she neared him, she saw Lord Astley raise his sword, his eyes filled with a murderous intent. He was aiming for Edmund's unprotected back, ready to deliver a fatal blow. Marjorie screamed, a wordless cry of warning, but it was too late. Astley's sword descended, slicing through the air, heading straight for Edmund's heart. But then, something unexpected happened. A figure stepped in front of Edmund, intercepting Astley's blow. It was Lady Agnes, Edmund's aunt, the woman who had shown Marjorie nothing but disdain and hostility. Agnes took the full force of the blow, her body crumpling to the ground, her eyes filled with a mixture of shock and pain. But there was also something else in her eyes, a flicker of regret, of redemption. Edmund roared, a primal sound of grief and rage. He turned on Astley, his sword a blur of motion, his face contorted with fury. He fought with a renewed intensity, driven by a desperate need for vengeance. The tide of the battle began to turn. The king's guards, alerted by the commotion, arrived on the scene, joining the fray, fighting alongside Edmund and Marjorie. Astley's men, realizing they were outnumbered and outmatched, began to falter, their attack losing momentum. Astley himself was disarmed and captured, his face pale with fear, his eyes darting around the courtyard, seeking an escape. But there was no escape. His treachery had been exposed, his plot foiled, his ambition crushed. The battle ended as quickly as it had begun. The courtyard was littered with bodies, the air thick with the smell of blood and sweat. Edmund stood amidst the carnage, his sword dripping with blood, his face grim and weary. He looked at Marjorie, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and something else, something that resembled love. But their moment of shared victory was short-lived. Marjorie's gaze fell upon Lady Agnes, lying motionless on the ground, her lifeblood staining the cobblestones. She rushed to her side, kneeling beside her, her heart filled with a profound sadness.
"Why?"
she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "Why did you do it?" Agnes opened her eyes, her gaze flickering towards Edmund. "He is my family," she whispered, her voice weak and raspy. "I could not let him die." She coughed, a spasm of pain racking her body. "I was wrong about you," she said, her gaze meeting Marjorie's. "You are worthy of him." Her eyes closed, her breathing stilled. Lady Agnes, the serpent in the garden, the woman who had plotted and schemed, had sacrificed herself to save Edmund, to redeem herself, to atone for her sins. Marjorie felt tears streaming down her face, tears of grief, of regret, of understanding. She had misjudged Agnes, had seen only her hostility, her bitterness, her ambition. She had not seen the love, the loyalty, the hidden depths of her character. Edmund knelt beside her, his hand gently touching her shoulder. He looked at Agnes, his face filled with a profound sorrow. "She was flawed," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But she was family, and she died with honor." He looked at Marjorie, his eyes filled with a tenderness that she had never seen before. "And you," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "You fought like a lioness. You saved my life." He reached out and gently wiped away her tears, his touch sending a shiver of warmth through her body. She leaned into his touch. "We saved each other," she said simply. Chapter 11. A Dance of Deception. The aftermath of the battle was a whirlwind of activity. Lord Astley and his co-conspirators were imprisoned, awaiting trial for treason. The king, shaken by the revelation of the plot and deeply grateful for Edmund and Marjorie's intervention, showered them with praise and rewards. He publicly acknowledged their loyalty, their courage, their service to the realm. But beneath the surface of public acclaim, Marjorie felt a lingering unease. The conspiracy had been exposed, the traitors punished, but the root of the problem remained. The deep-seated rivalry between the Winthorne and Warwick families, the centuries of animosity and mistrust, could not be erased by a single act of heroism. She knew that there were still those within the court, within the Warwick household, who resented her, who doubted her, who saw her as an outsider, an enemy. She had to tread carefully, to navigate the treacherous currents of court politics, to build alliances, to consolidate her position. She also had to deal with her own conflicting emotions. She had fought alongside Edmund, had saved his life, had witnessed his grief and his gratitude. She had seen a glimpse of the man beneath the warrior, the man who was capable of both ruthlessness and tenderness. She was drawn to him, attracted to his strength, his courage, his vulnerability. But she could not forget the past, the pain he had caused her family, the loss of her brother. She was caught between her growing feelings for him and the lingering shadow of her hatred. Edmund, for his part, seemed to be equally conflicted. He treated her with a newfound respect, a tenderness that was both unsettling and alluring. He sought her out, engaged her in conversation, shared his thoughts and his concerns. He seemed to be trying to bridge the chasm that separated them, to build a relationship based on trust and mutual respect. But there were also moments when he seemed to retreat, to withdraw into himself, to put up a wall between them. He would become distant, unreadable, his eyes filled with a sadness that she could not fathom. She sensed that he was still haunted by the past, by the loss of his first love, by the burden of his responsibilities. One evening, as they strolled through the castle gardens, Edmund turned to her, his expression serious. "I know that this marriage was not what you wanted," he said, his voice low and hesitant. "That you still harbor resentment towards me." Marjorie hesitated, unsure how to respond. She could not deny the truth of his words, but she also could not ignore the growing feelings she had for him. "The past cannot be undone," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "But I am willing to try to build a future. Together." He looked at her, his eyes searching her face, as if assessing her sincerity.
"Do you mean that?"
he asked, his voice filled with a mixture of hope and apprehension. "I do," she replied, her voice firm, her gaze unwavering. "I may not love you yet," she added, her voice softer now, "but I respect you. I admire you, and I am drawn to you." He smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. "That is more than I could have hoped for," he said. "And perhaps in time love will grow." He reached out and took her hand, his touch sending a shiver of warmth through her body. They stood there for a moment, their hands clasped, their eyes locked, the silence between them filled with unspoken possibilities. But their moment of intimacy was interrupted by the arrival of a messenger, bearing a sealed scroll with the royal crest. Edmund took the scroll, breaking the seal with a swift, practiced movement. He scanned the contents, his face growing grim. "The king requests our presence at a council meeting," he said, his voice devoid of any emotion. "There are matters of state that require our attention." Marjorie felt a knot of apprehension tighten in her stomach. She had a feeling that this council meeting was not about routine matters, that it was a trap, a carefully orchestrated maneuver to test their loyalty, to expose any lingering doubts, to separate them. It was a dance of deception, and she knew they have to move carefully. As they walked, hand in hand, she felt a strange resolve. She did not know what would happen, but she knew she would not be defeated. Chapter 12. The Lioness Bares Her Claws. The council chamber was a scene of hushed tension. The king sat at the head of the long, wooden table, his face grim and unyielding. Around the table sat the most powerful nobles in the realm, their expressions carefully neutral, their eyes watchful. Marjorie and Edmund were seated together, slightly apart from the others, a subtle indication of their precarious position. The king began by recounting the events of the recent rebellion, praising Edmund and Marjorie for their bravery and loyalty. But then his tone shifted, becoming sharper, more accusatory. "However," he said, his voice echoing through the silent chamber, "there are lingering questions. Doubts about the true nature of this alliance, about the depth of your commitment to the realm." He looked directly at Marjorie, his gaze piercing. "Lady Warwick," he said, his voice heavy with suspicion. "You are of Winthorne blood, a family with a history of defiance, of rebellion." Marjorie felt a surge of anger, but she forced herself to remain composed. She had anticipated this, had prepared for this moment. She would not be intimidated, she would not be cowed. "My loyalty is to my husband and to the realm," she replied, her voice clear and steady, her gaze unwavering. "My family's past is not my own. I have proven my loyalty through my actions." The king remained unconvinced. "Actions can be deceiving," he said. "Loyalty is not easily earned nor easily proven." He turned to Edmund, his gaze equally sharp. "Lord Warwick," he said, "you vouch for your wife's loyalty? You stake your reputation on her fidelity?" Edmund met the king's gaze, his expression resolute. "I do," he said, his voice firm and unwavering. "I trust my wife implicitly. She has proven herself time and again. She is my partner, my ally, my strength." His words were a powerful declaration of support, a testament to his faith in her. Marjorie felt a surge of gratitude, of affection for him. He had stood by her, defended her, risked his own standing to protect her. But the king was not swayed. He gestured towards a shadowy figure standing near the entrance to the chamber. "Bring forth the witness," he commanded. A man stepped forward, his face hidden in the shadows of a hooded cloak. Marjorie felt a chill run down her spine. She recognized the figure, the build, the scent. It was the cloaked figure she'd bumped into in the hall, the spy, the one who had been watching her, listening to her conversations. Lady Agnes's servant. The witness began to speak, his voice low and muffled, recounting a fabricated tale of Marjorie's supposed treachery. He claimed that she had been secretly communicating with enemies of the realm, that she had been plotting to undermine Edmund's authority, that she had been planning to betray him. Marjorie listened in stunned silence, her mind reeling. The accusations were false, outrageous, but they were also cleverly crafted. They played on the existing doubts and suspicions about her Winthorne heritage, her past grievances, her supposed ambition. She looked at Edmund, seeking his support, his reassurance. But his face was unreadable. His eyes were fixed on the witness, his expression guarded. She could not tell what he was thinking, what he was feeling. Was he believing these lies? Was he doubting her? The king turned to Marjorie, his gaze filled with a cold fury. "Lady Warwick," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "You stand accused of treason, of betraying your husband and your realm. What say you?" Marjorie felt a surge of anger, of indignation, of betrayal. She had been set up, framed, manipulated. And Edmund, the man she had begun to trust, the man she had fought alongside, the man she had almost loved, seemed to be abandoning her. But she would not break. She would not yield. She was Lady Marjorie of Winthorne, and she would not be defeated by lies and deception. She would fight back. She would bare her claws. "These accusations are false," she declared, her voice ringing through the silent chamber. "This witness is a liar, a pawn in a larger game, a game to divide us, to weaken us, to destroy us." She stood up, her eyes flashing with defiance, her voice filled with a power that surprised even herself. "I have proven my loyalty time and again. I have fought for this realm, bled for this realm, risked my life for this realm. And I will not be judged by the lies of a traitor." She turned to the assembled nobles, her gaze sweeping across their faces. "You know me. You have seen my actions. You have witnessed my commitment. Do not let yourselves be deceived by these lies. Do not let this kingdom be torn apart by suspicion and mistrust." She turned back to the king, her voice softening slightly, her gaze pleading. "Your Majesty," she said, "I implore you see the truth. Do not let these traitors win. Do not let them destroy everything we have fought for." She stopped and took a deep breath. She had one more thing to say, even if it cost her everything. "If my husband, Lord Warwick, no longer believes in me, then take my life. I will not live, nor serve a king who does not see my heart." Chapter 13. Echoes of a Lost Love. A hush fell over the council chamber. Marjorie's impassioned plea, her bold challenge, had stunned the assembled nobles into silence. Even the king seemed momentarily taken aback by her fierce defiance. All eyes turned to Edmund. His reaction, his words, would determine Marjorie's fate. He stood slowly, his gaze fixed on Marjorie, his expression a complex mixture of emotions. He looked at her, not as a pawn in a political game, but as a woman, a warrior, a partner. He saw her strength, her courage, her unwavering loyalty. He saw the truth in her eyes, the passion in her voice, the unwavering belief in her heart. He walked towards her, his steps measured and deliberate. He stopped in front of her, his gaze locking with hers. The silence in the chamber was deafening, the tension almost unbearable. "I believe you," he said, his voice low but firm, his words echoing through the silent chamber. "I have never doubted you." He turned to the king, his expression resolute. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice ringing with authority, "this witness is a liar. These accusations are false. My wife is innocent." He drew his sword, the steel flashing in the dim light of the chamber. He placed the blade at the king's feet, a gesture of ultimate loyalty, of ultimate sacrifice. "I stake my life, my honor, my lands on her innocence," he declared. "If you doubt her, then you doubt me. And I will not serve a king who does not trust his most loyal subjects." His words were a bold challenge, a defiant act of faith in Marjorie. He had risked everything for her, his position, his power, his very life. He had chosen her, trusted her, stood by her, against all odds. The king was visibly shaken by Edmund's declaration. He looked at Marjorie, at Edmund, at the assembled nobles, his expression shifting from anger to uncertainty. He realized that he had been manipulated, deceived, led astray by his own advisors, by his own prejudices. He gestured for the guards to seize the false witness. "Take him away," he commanded, his voice filled with a weary resignation. "Investigate his claims. Uncover the truth behind this deception." He turned to Marjorie and Edmund, his gaze softening slightly. "Lord Warwick," he said, "Lady Warwick, I apologize for my misjudgment, for doubting your loyalty. You have proven yourselves to be true servants of the realm." He retrieved Edmund's sword, handing it back to him, a gesture of reconciliation, of renewed trust. "Rise," he said, "and continue to serve with honor and with courage." Marjorie and Edmund rose, their hands clasped together, their eyes locked in a silent exchange of gratitude, of relief, of something more. They had weathered the storm, overcome the deception, emerged stronger, closer, more united than ever before. As they left the council chamber, hand in hand, they were met with a chorus of cheers and applause. The assembled nobles, moved by their courage, their loyalty, their unwavering belief in each other, acknowledged their victory, their vindication. But the victory was bittersweet. The scars of the past, the echoes of lost love, the lingering doubts and suspicions could not be erased completely. As they returned to their chambers, a silence fell between them, a subtle reminder of the challenges that still lay ahead. Edmund stopped at the entrance to Marjorie's chambers, his hand lingering on hers. He began, his voice hesitant, his eyes searching her face. "I need to tell you something." Marjorie looked at him, her heart filled with a mixture of apprehension and anticipation. She sensed that he was about to reveal something important, something personal, something that could change everything. "Alara," he said, his voice barely a whisper, his gaze fixed on some distant memory. "The woman I lost, she was not killed in a raid, as I had believed." Marjorie felt a chill run down her spine. She remembered his earlier confession, his grief over the loss of his first love. She had assumed it was a closed chapter, a wound that had healed, albeit with a scar. But now, it seemed, the wound was still open, still raw, still bleeding. "She betrayed me," he continued, his voice filled with a pain that was almost palpable. "She was a spy. For Winthorne." Marjorie gasped, her mind reeling. Alara, a spy for Winthorne? The woman Edmund had loved, the woman he had mourned, had been working for her family, against him? It was a cruel twist of fate, a devastating revelation that shattered her preconceived notions, her carefully constructed reality. The handmaiden's name. It had been a clue all along. "I discovered the truth too late," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "She was executed for treason. By my own order." He looked at her, and she saw what she had seen the very first time she saw him, in the cathedral. Pain. Loss. I have lived with that for all these years. Chapter 14. The Scars That Bind. Marjorie felt a wave of emotions wash over her: shock, disbelief, compassion, and a profound sense of guilt. The woman Edmund had loved, the woman he had mourned, had been a spy for her family, a traitor to him. And he had been forced to order her execution, to live with the burden of that decision, the pain of that loss for all these years. She understood now the sadness in his eyes, the weariness in his posture, the wall he had built around his heart. He had been betrayed, not only by his love, but also by the family she represented. The chasm between them, already vast, seemed to deepen, to become almost insurmountable. I am so sorry," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. She could not undo the past, could not erase his pain, could not bring back the woman he had lost. But she could offer him her understanding, her compassion, her empathy. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of grief and something else. something that resembled forgiveness. "It was not your fault," he said, his voice low and hoarse. "You were a child. You had nothing to do with it." He reached out and gently touched her cheek, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw. His touch was surprisingly tender, sending a shiver of warmth through her body. "I blamed Winthorn for years," he continued, his voice barely a whisper. "I hated your family, your name, everything you represented." He paused, his gaze searching her face, as if seeking some sign of understanding, of acceptance. "But then I met you," he said, his voice filled with a newfound tenderness. "And I saw something different. Something that challenged my hatred, my prejudice, my pain." He took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. "You are not Alara," he said, his voice firm, his gaze unwavering. "You are Marjorie. And you have shown me that love and loyalty can transcend even the deepest wounds." His words were a balm to her soul, a release from the burden of guilt she had been carrying. He had forgiven her, not for her family's sins, but for her own sake. He had seen her, truly seen her, for who she was, not for what she represented. She leaned into his touch, her heart filled with a gratitude, a relief, a growing affection for him. She had been afraid that his revelation would destroy any chance of a future together, that it would push them further apart. But instead, it had brought them closer, had forged a bond between them, a bond based on shared pain, on mutual understanding, on forgiveness. "I know that the past cannot be erased," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "But I hope that we can build a future together, a future free from hatred and mistrust." He smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. "I believe we can," he said, his voice filled with a newfound hope. "We have both suffered enough. It is time to heal, to forgive, to love." He leaned in and kissed her, a gentle, tentative kiss that was both a promise and a plea. It was a kiss that sealed their bond, that acknowledged their shared pain, that opened the door to a future filled with possibilities. As they stood there, embraced in the quiet intimacy of her chambers, Marjorie felt a sense of peace, of contentment, of belonging. She had found a home in his arms, a refuge from the storms of the past, a promise of a brighter future. She had found a love that was unexpected, unconventional, but real. A love that was forged in the crucible of pain and forgiveness, a love that had the power to heal, to transform, to transcend. The scars of the past would always be there, a reminder of the wounds they had both suffered. But they would no longer be a barrier, a source of division. They would be a testament to their resilience, their strength, their ability to overcome adversity, to find love and forgiveness in the most unlikely of places. They would bind, not break. Chapter 15. A Knight's Confession. The days that followed were a period of quiet intimacy and tentative exploration. Marjorie and Edmund spent hours together, talking, sharing their thoughts, their fears, their hopes. They explored the castle and its surrounding lands, riding horses, walking through the gardens, discovering hidden corners and shared moments of peace. They began to build a relationship based on trust, on mutual respect, on a growing affection that was both tender and passionate. They learned to navigate their differences, to understand their individual needs, to support each other's strengths and weaknesses. Edmund, in particular, seemed to blossom under Marjorie's influence. He shed his stoic facade, revealing a warmth, a humor, a vulnerability that she had only glimpsed before. He laughed more freely, smiled more often, and allowed himself to express his emotions without reservation. He also shared more about his past, about his childhood, about his training as a knight, about the burdens of leadership he had carried since a young age. He spoke of his father, a stern and demanding man who had instilled in him a strong sense of duty, of honor, of responsibility. "He always told me that a Warwick never yields," Edmund said one evening, as they sat by the fire in his private chambers. "That we must always be strong, be resolute, be unyielding." He paused, his gaze fixed on the flickering flames, his expression tinged with a hint of sadness. "But sometimes," he continued, his voice barely a whisper, "it is harder to yield than to fight. It is harder to forgive than to seek revenge. It is harder to love than to hate. Marjorie reached out and took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. She understood his struggle, the internal conflict between his upbringing, his ingrained beliefs, and his growing feelings for her. "You are not your father," she said, her voice soft but firm. "You are Edmund, and you have shown me that a Warwick can be both strong and gentle, both resolute and compassionate, both unyielding and forgiving." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a gratitude, a relief, a love that took her breath away. "You have taught me that," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You have shown me a different way, a way to be true to myself while still honoring my heritage." He leaned in and kissed her, a passionate kiss that was both a declaration and a promise. It was a kiss that sealed their bond, that acknowledged their shared journey, that opened the door to a future filled with love. As they lay together, wrapped in each other's arms, Edmund began to share a secret, a burden he had carried for years, a confession that would test the limits of their newfound love. "There is something else you should know," he said, his voice hesitant, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and shame. "Something about the battle that changed everything." Marjorie felt a knot of apprehension tighten in her stomach. She sensed that this confession was going to be painful, that it would challenge her understanding of the past, of Edmund, of herself. "Your brother Liam," he continued, his voice barely a whisper. "He did not die a hero's death, as the reports claimed." Marjorie's heart skipped a beat. She had always suspected that the official account of Liam's death was incomplete, that there was more to the story than she had been told. But she had never dared to imagine the truth, the brutal reality that Edmund was about to reveal. "He surrendered," Edmund said, his voice choked with emotion. "He laid down his sword and begged for mercy." Marjorie felt a wave of shock, of disbelief, of anger. Liam, her brave, defiant brother, had surrendered? Had begged for mercy? It was unimaginable, unthinkable, a betrayal of everything she had believed about him. "And I," Edmund continued, his voice trembling, his eyes filled with a torment that was almost unbearable to witness. "I refused his plea. I ordered his execution." The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of guilt, of shame, of responsibility. Edmund had killed her brother, not in the heat of battle, but in cold blood, after he had surrendered. He had denied him mercy, had condemned him to death, had shattered her family's legacy. It was true. All this time, it had been true. Marjorie felt a surge of rage, of hatred, of a profound sense of betrayal. She wanted to scream, to lash out, to punish him for his cruelty, for his unforgivable act. But she also saw the pain in his eyes, the torment in his soul, the burden of guilt he had carried for all these years. She closed her eyes for just one moment. Only one. She had to make a choice. Chapter 16. The Gathering Storm. Marjorie opened her eyes, and the rage she had felt moments before had cooled, replaced by a profound sadness, a deep ache in her heart. She looked at Edmund, saw the torment in his eyes, the self-loathing in his posture, the crushing weight of the guilt he had carried for so long. She reached out and touched his face, her fingers tracing the lines of pain etched around his mouth. Her touch was gentle, hesitant, a tentative offering of understanding. "Why?" she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "Why did you do it?" Edmund closed his eyes, a single tear escaping and tracing a path down his cheek. He seemed to shrink in on himself, the proud warrior, the confident leader, reduced to a broken man, haunted by the ghosts of his past. "I was young," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I was full of rage and hatred. I wanted to punish Winthorne for Alara's death. I wanted to make them suffer as I had suffered." He opened his eyes, his gaze locking with hers, pleading for understanding, for forgiveness. "I saw him as a symbol of everything I hated," he continued, his voice trembling. "I did not see him as a man, a brother, a son. I saw him as an enemy, and I acted without mercy, without compassion, without honor." He bowed his head, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. He was consumed by remorse, by self-loathing, by the crushing weight of his guilt. Marjorie felt a complex mix of emotions swirling within her. Anger, yes, but also pity. Hatred, but also compassion. Betrayal, but also a strange sense of understanding. She had hated Edmund for years, had blamed him for her family's downfall, for her brother's death. She had sought revenge, had plotted his destruction, had dreamed of making him pay for his sins. But now, seeing him broken, vulnerable, consumed by remorse, she realized that he had been suffering too. He had been living with the consequences of his actions, with the burden of his guilt, with the knowledge that he had acted without honor, without mercy. She knew that forgiveness would not come easily, that the pain of Liam's death would always be a part of her. But she also knew that holding on to hatred, seeking revenge, would only perpetuate the cycle of violence, of pain, of suffering. She reached out and took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. Her touch was firm, reassuring, a silent offering of support. "I cannot condone what you did," she said, her voice soft but firm. "But I can understand the circumstances that led to it. I can see the pain you have carried all these years." She paused, her gaze searching his face, seeking some sign of hope, of redemption. "I believe that people can change," she continued, her voice filled with a newfound conviction. "That even the darkest sins can be atoned for. That forgiveness is possible even when it seems impossible." Edmund looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude, of relief, of a glimmer of hope. "Do you mean that?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Can you ever forgive me?" Marjorie hesitated. Forgiveness was a journey, not a destination. It was a process, not a single act. She could not simply erase the pain of Liam's death, could not forget the cruelty of Edmund's actions. But she could choose to move forward, to build a future based on trust, on understanding, on love. "I don't know," she said, her voice honest and raw. "But I am willing to try. I am willing to work towards it. With you." Her words were a lifeline, a beacon of hope in the darkness of his despair. He squeezed her hand, his touch conveying a gratitude that words could not express. As they sat there, holding each other, a sense of peace settled over them. It was a fragile peace, a tentative truce, but it was a start. They had faced the darkest secrets of their past, had confronted the demons that haunted them, and had emerged, wounded but not broken, with a glimmer of hope for a brighter future. But their newfound peace was soon shattered by the arrival of a messenger, bearing urgent news from the north. The rebellion, which they had thought contained, had erupted again, with renewed force and ferocity. The king was summoning Edmund to lead his forces north, to crush the rebellion once and for all. Marjorie felt a chill run down her spine. The gathering storm had arrived. War was upon them, and their fragile love, their tentative forgiveness, would be tested once again. The time for healing had ended. It was time for action. Time for the lion and the dove to fight together. Chapter 17. Flames of Rebellion. The journey north was arduous and fraught with tension. The landscape mirrored the turmoil within Marjorie's heart, bleak, desolate, and unforgiving. The closer they got to the heart of the rebellion, the more palpable the sense of danger became. Skirmishes with rebel forces were frequent, and the threat of ambush loomed large. Edmund, despite the weight of his past and the uncertainty of their future, was a changed man. The confession, though agonizing, had lifted a burden from his shoulders. He was still a formidable warrior, a skilled leader, but there was a new depth to him, a compassion that had been buried beneath layers of guilt and self-loathing. He treated his men with respect, listened to their concerns, and made decisions with a wisdom that went beyond mere tactical prowess. He also treated Marjorie differently. He was no longer just her husband, her captor, the man who had brought ruin to her family. He was her partner, her confidant, her lover. He sought her counsel, valued her opinions, and treated her as an equal in every way. Marjorie, for her part, found herself struggling with her own conflicting emotions. She had offered Edmund forgiveness, had pledged to work towards a future together, but the pain of Liam's death was still raw, the wound still fresh. She found herself watching Edmund, searching his face for any sign of the ruthlessness, the cruelty that had led him to execute her brother. But she found only kindness, compassion, and a deep-seated remorse that mirrored her own grief. She saw the way he interacted with his men, the respect he commanded, the loyalty he inspired. She saw the way he looked at her, with a tenderness, a vulnerability that melted her defenses, chipped away at her remaining anger. One evening, as they camped beneath a star-studded sky, Marjorie found herself unable to contain her doubts any longer. "Do you ever think about him?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, her gaze fixed on the flickering flames of the campfire. "About Liam?" Edmund looked at her, his eyes filled with a sadness that mirrored her own. "Every day," he said, his voice low and hoarse. "Every night. He haunts my dreams." He paused, his gaze shifting to the distant horizon, his expression tinged with a profound regret. "I would give anything to undo what I did," he continued, his voice trembling slightly. "To take back that moment of madness, of cruelty. To have shown him mercy instead of vengeance." Marjorie reached out and touched his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. Her touch was a silent offering of understanding, of shared grief. "I know," she said, her voice soft but firm. "And I believe you." She looked at him, her eyes searching his face, seeking some sign of hope, of healing. "We cannot change the past," she continued, "but we can learn from it. We can choose a different path. A path of forgiveness, of compassion, of love." Edmund squeezed her hand, his touch conveying a gratitude that words could not express. He leaned in and kissed her, a gentle, tender kiss that was both a promise and a plea. It was a kiss that sealed their bond, that acknowledged their shared pain, that opened the door to a future filled with hope. But their moment of intimacy was short-lived. A scout arrived, breathless and urgent, bearing news of a large rebel force approaching their position. They were outnumbered, outflanked, and facing a desperate battle for survival. Edmund immediately sprang into action, issuing orders, preparing his men for the coming onslaught. He was calm, collected, and decisive, the experienced warrior, the skilled leader, taking charge. Marjorie watched him, her heart filled with a mixture of fear and admiration. She knew that this battle would be a test, not only of their military strength, but also of their newfound love, their fragile forgiveness, their ability to stand together against a common enemy. As the first flames of rebellion lit the horizon, she put on her armor and rode beside him. Chapter 18. A choice between two worlds. The battle was fierce and brutal, a chaotic clash of steel and blood under a smoke-filled sky. Marjorie fought alongside Edmund, her initial fear replaced by a steely determination. She had trained with her brother, had honed her skills, and now she put them to use with a surprising ferocity. She was no longer just a noble lady, a pawn in a political game. She was a warrior, fighting for her life, for her husband, for her future. She saw Edmund fighting nearby, his movements fluid and graceful despite the desperate odds. He was a force of nature, cutting down enemies, rallying his men, inspiring them with his courage and his unwavering determination. He fought not with the blind rage of his youth, but with a measured intensity, a focused purpose that was both terrifying and awe-inspiring. Marjorie found herself fighting back-to-back with Edmund, their movements synchronized, their skills complementing each other. They were a team, a partnership forged in the crucible of battle, their love and loyalty tested by the flames of rebellion. But despite their combined efforts, the rebel forces were overwhelming. They were outnumbered, outflanked, and slowly being pushed back. The tide of the battle seemed to turn against them, and the hope of victory began to fade. As the fighting intensified, Marjorie found herself separated from Edmund, surrounded by a group of rebel soldiers. She fought with a desperate courage, parrying blows, dodging attacks, but she was slowly being overwhelmed. She saw a familiar face among the rebel ranks, a young man with fiery red hair and a fierce determination in his eyes. It was a distant cousin, a Winthorn, fighting on the side of the rebellion. He recognized her, his eyes widening in surprise, then narrowing with a mixture of hatred and confusion. Marjorie? He shouted, his voice barely audible above the din of battle. What are you doing? Fighting for them? For the Warwicks? Marjorie hesitated, her heart torn between her loyalty to Edmund and her lingering connection to her family, to her past. I am fighting for what I believe in, she replied, her voice firm despite the tremor in her heart. For peace. For justice. For a future free from hatred and bloodshed. Her cousin scoffed, his eyes filled with disdain. You have betrayed your family, he said. Your heritage. Your brother's memory. His words struck her like a physical blow, reawakening the pain of Liam's death, the guilt she had carried for so long. She faltered, her guard dropping, her resolve momentarily shaken. The rebel soldiers seized the opportunity, attacking her with renewed vigor. She fought back, but she was tired, outnumbered, and losing ground. She felt a sharp pain in her side, a searing agony that made her gasp for breath. She stumbled, falling to her knees, her sword slipping from her grasp. She looked up, expecting to see the triumphant faces of her attackers, the cold steel of their swords descending upon her. But instead, she saw Edmund. He had fought his way through the rebel ranks, cutting down anyone who stood in his path. He stood over her, his sword raised, his face a mask of fury and protectiveness. He was a shield, a guardian, a warrior defending his love, his partner, his wife. He engaged the rebel soldiers, his movements swift and deadly. He fought with a ferocity that she had never seen before, driven by a desperate need to protect her, to save her, to atone for his past sins. He defeated her attackers one by one until only her cousin remained. Edmund stood over him, his sword pointed at his throat, his eyes filled with a cold, hard light. Yield, Edmund commanded, his voice devoid of any emotion.
Or die.
Her cousin hesitated, his eyes flickering between Edmund and Marjorie. He saw the determination in Edmund's face, the unwavering resolve, the willingness to kill. He also saw the pleading look in Marjorie's eyes, the silent appeal for mercy, for compassion. He lowered his sword, surrendering to Edmund, choosing life over death, family over vengeance. Edmund sheathed his sword, his gaze softening as he turned to Marjorie. He knelt beside her, his hands gently examining her wound. It was not life-threatening, but it was deep and painful. I am here, he said, his voice filled with a tenderness that melted her remaining defenses. I will not leave you. She could only nod as he lifted her into his strong arms. Chapter 19. The Siege of Hearts. Edmund carried Marjorie back to their camp, his steps sure and steady despite the chaos of the retreating army. He laid her gently on a makeshift bed, his hands hovering over her, his eyes filled with a concern that bordered on panic. He barked orders at the camp healers, demanding they attend to her immediately, his voice laced with a desperation that belied his usual calm demeanor. Marjorie, despite the throbbing pain in her side, felt a surge of warmth, of love, for this man who had once been her enemy, who had caused her so much pain, but who now stood by her side, her protector, her champion, her husband. The healers worked quickly, cleaning and binding her wound, their movements efficient and practiced. Edmund never left her side, holding her hand, whispering words of comfort and reassurance, his presence a soothing balm to her pain and fear. As the healers finished their work, Edmund dismissed them, his gaze fixed on Marjorie, his eyes searching her face for any sign of discomfort, of lingering pain. How do you feel? He asked, his voice low and hesitant, his hand gently stroking her hair. Better, she replied, her voice weak but sincere. Thank you for saving me. He smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes, a smile that melted her heart. I will always save you, he said, his voice firm, his gaze unwavering. You are my wife, my love, my life. His words were a balm to her soul, a promise of a future filled with love, with loyalty, with unwavering devotion. She leaned into his touch, her heart overflowing with a gratitude, a tenderness, a love that she had never thought possible. But their moment of intimacy was interrupted by the arrival of a messenger, bearing news from the front lines. The rebel forces, despite their initial advantage, had been routed, their leader captured, the rebellion crushed. The battle was won, the war was over, but at a great cost. Many lives had been lost, many wounds inflicted, and the scars of the conflict would linger for years to come. Edmund listened to the messenger's report, his expression shifting from relief to a profound sadness. He knew that victory in war was never truly sweet, that it always came at a price, that the cost of bloodshed was always too high. He turned back to Marjorie, his eyes filled with a mixture of weariness and hope. "It is over," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "We have won. But the real battle begins now." He was referring to the battle for peace, for reconciliation, for the healing of the wounds that had been inflicted, not only on the battlefield, but also in their hearts. He was referring to the challenge of rebuilding trust, of forging a new future, of overcoming the legacy of hatred and division that had plagued their families, their kingdom, for so long. Marjorie understood. She knew that the road ahead would be difficult, that there would be challenges, setbacks, and moments of doubt. But she also knew that they would face them together, as partners, as lovers, as husband and wife. As the days turned into weeks, Marjorie slowly recovered from her wound. Edmund remained by her side, attending to her needs, showering her with affection, demonstrating his love and devotion in countless small ways. He was a changed man, transformed by his past mistakes, by his newfound love, by his commitment to building a better future. He also made a decision that surprised everyone, including Marjorie. He released her cousin, the Windthorn who had fought on the side of the rebellion, granting him clemency, offering him a chance to return to his family, to rebuild his life. "Vengeance will not bring peace," Edmund said, explaining his decision to his council. "Only forgiveness and compassion can heal the wounds of the past." His act of mercy, his willingness to forgive his former enemy, sent a powerful message throughout the kingdom. It was a sign of his commitment to reconciliation, to building a new era of peace and understanding, to breaking the cycle of violence and hatred that had plagued their land for so long. As Marjorie and Edmund prepared to return to Warwick Keep, they knew that their journey was far from over. They had won the battle, survived the siege, but the true test of their love, their loyalty, their commitment to each other, would be in the days, the weeks, the years to come. It would be in building, together, a lasting peace, not just for the kingdom, but in their hearts. Chapter 20. The Reckoning of Love and Duty. The return to Warwick Keep was not a triumphant homecoming, but a quiet, introspective journey. The war had changed them, both individually and as a couple. The scars of battle, both physical and emotional, served as constant reminders of the price of conflict, the fragility of peace, and the enduring power of love and forgiveness. Marjorie, though still recovering from her wound, found a new strength within herself. She was no longer the naive, vengeful girl who had arrived at Warwick Keep, a prisoner in a gilded cage. She was a woman, a warrior, a wife, who had faced death, overcome adversity, and found love in the most unlikely of places. Edmund, too, was transformed. He had shed the burden of his past, atoned for his sins, and embraced a new path, a path of compassion, of forgiveness, of love. He was still a formidable leader, a skilled warrior, but there was a new gentleness to him, a vulnerability that made him even more compelling, more human. As they settled back into life at Warwick Keep, they faced a new set of challenges. The aftermath of the rebellion had left the land scarred, the people weary, and the economy in ruins. They had to rebuild trust, restore order, and heal the wounds of division that had festered for so long. Marjorie, drawing on her own experiences, took an active role in the rebuilding efforts. She worked tirelessly to improve the lives of the common people, to promote justice and fairness, to create a society where everyone had the opportunity to thrive. She became known as Marjorie the Merciful, a testament to her compassion, her wisdom, and her unwavering commitment to the well-being of her people. Edmund, guided by Marjorie's influence and his own transformed heart, implemented policies that fostered reconciliation, encouraged trade, and promoted education. He sought to create a kingdom where peace and prosperity reigned, where the rule of law prevailed, and where the rights of all citizens were protected. But their greatest challenge was not political or economic, but personal. It was the challenge of building a lasting relationship, of nurturing their love, of overcoming the lingering shadows of the past. They had to learn to trust each other completely, to communicate openly and honestly, to forgive each other's flaws and imperfections. They had moments of doubt, of disagreement, of lingering pain. The memory of Liam, the shadow of Alara, the weight of their past mistakes would occasionally resurface, threatening to undermine their newfound happiness. But they persevered. They talked, they listened, they supported each other through the difficult times. They learned to appreciate each other's strengths, to accept each other's weaknesses, to celebrate their shared victories, and to comfort each other during times of loss. One evening, as they sat together in their private chambers, Marjorie turned to Edmund, her eyes filled with a mixture of love and gratitude. "I never thought I could be this happy," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I never thought I could love you like this." Edmund smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes, a smile that lit up his face. He reached out and took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. "And I," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "never thought I could be worthy of your love. Never thought I could forgive myself. You have changed me, my love." He leaned in and kissed her, a passionate kiss that was both a declaration and a promise. It was a kiss that sealed their bond, that acknowledged their shared journey, that celebrated their enduring love. As they held each other close, they knew that their journey was far from over. There would be challenges ahead, obstacles to overcome, moments of doubt and uncertainty. But they also knew that they would face them together as partners, as lovers, as husband and wife. Their reckoning had come, and it had not broken them. They had found love in the midst of war, forgiveness in the face of betrayal, and hope in the ashes of despair. They had built a life together, a future filled with promise, a legacy of peace and reconciliation that would endure for generations to come. The duty of their stations was intertwined with the love in their hearts, and they would see it through, together. Epilogue. Years passed, seasons changed, and the scars of war slowly faded, replaced by the gentle rhythms of peace and prosperity. Warwick Keep, once a symbol of division and conflict, became a beacon of hope and reconciliation, a testament to the transformative power of love and forgiveness. Marjorie and Edmund ruled wisely and justly, their reign marked by compassion, fairness, and a deep commitment to the well-being of their people. They became known as Edmund the Just and Marjorie the Merciful, a royal couple who had overcome adversity, healed the wounds of the past, and forged a new era of peace and understanding. They had children, sons and daughters who inherited their parents' strength, their courage, and their unwavering commitment to justice. The children grew up in a world free from the hatred and division that had plagued their parents' generation, a world where the names Winthorne and Warwick were no longer symbols of animosity, but of unity and cooperation. Marjorie and Edmund often walked together in the gardens of Warwick Keep, reminiscing about their past, reflecting on their journey, and marveling at the unlikely love that had blossomed amidst the ruins of war. They would hold hands, their fingers intertwined, their eyes filled with a tenderness, a gratitude, a love that had endured the test of time. One evening, as the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the landscape, Edmund turned to Marjorie, his voice filled with a mixture of love and awe. "Do you remember that first day?" he asked, his gaze fixed on her face, his eyes searching her eyes. "When I lifted your veil and saw your face for the first time." Marjorie smiled, a gentle, knowing smile that crinkled the corners of her eyes. "Of course," she replied, her voice soft but firm. "I thought you were my enemy." Edmund chuckled, a low, rumbling sound that was filled with warmth and affection. "And you were mine," he said. "But fate had other plans for us." He reached out and gently touched her cheek, his fingers tracing the lines of time that had etched themselves onto her face. He saw not the fading beauty of youth, but the enduring beauty of a love that had weathered the storms of life, a love that had grown stronger, deeper, more profound with each passing year. "I asked you what you would do if you found something else besides hatred," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "And you did. You found love. And you gave me the greatest gift of all. You forgave me." Marjorie leaned into his touch, her heart overflowing with a love that was both timeless and ever new. She had found something else, indeed. She had found a love that had transformed her, healed her, made her whole. "And you," she said, her voice filled with a tenderness that brought tears to his eyes. "You found redemption. You became the man you were always meant to be." They stood there, silhouetted against the setting sun, two figures bound together by a love that had defied the odds, a love that had conquered hatred, a love that had healed the wounds of the past. They were no longer just a lord and a lady, a warrior and a captive, a Winthorne and a Warwick. They were simply Edmund and Marjorie, two souls intertwined, two hearts beating as one, two lovers who had found their way to each other through the darkness and into the light. Theirs was a marriage of fire and ice that had, against all odds, melted into a bond that would last an eternity. They turned, and hand in hand, walked back towards the keep.